Have you ever been in a conversation with someone, maybe a friend, a sibling, or even your own child, where things just spiral? You start off talking about something simple, maybe how you folded the laundry wrong, or who forgot to pick up the mail, and suddenly you're both knee-deep in years of resentment, old wounds, and words you can't take back. And afterward, you're left sitting in silence, wondering, what just happened? Why is it so hard to talk to the people I care about? If that sounds even a little familiar, you're not alone. Especially as we get older, staying connected with the people around us, our grown children, our spouses, our neighbors, becomes even more precious. But ironically, it also becomes trickier. We're more aware of time, of what matters and what doesn't. And sometimes that awareness can turn small disagreements into full-blown emotional storms. That's why in today's video, we're going to talk about something that might just save a relationship, or at the very least, help you feel more in control during tough conversations. This isn't about learning how to win arguments or get the last word. It's about learning how to stay connected even when you disagree. And yes, it is possible. Let's start with something most of us struggle with: the need to be right. We've all felt it. That urge to prove a point, especially when we know deep down we are right. But here's the truth. Trying to win a conversation with someone you care about is often a fast track to losing the connection. Because when a disagreement turns into a battle, someone always walks away feeling unheard or unloved, and sometimes both. So what do we do instead? You don't have to agree with the other person. You really don't. What matters more is showing them that you understand what matters to them. That's a powerful shift. You go from trying to change someone's mind to simply saying, "I see this is important to you." That simple act, acknowledging the value they place on something, can melt tension faster than any clever comeback ever could. Think about the last heated conversation you had. Maybe it was over politics, or a lifestyle choice, or even something like how to spend the holidays. Now imagine if, instead of trying to convince the other person to see things your way, you paused and said, "It seems like this really means something to you. Can you tell me more about why?" That one sentence can change the entire tone of the conversation. It takes you out of the "who's right" trap and puts you on the path to understanding each other better. That doesn't mean the disagreement disappears, but suddenly it doesn't feel like a war. It feels like two people trying to meet in the middle. And that middle ground? It's where real connection happens. One thing I've noticed over the years, and maybe you've seen this too, is that we often try to control people when we feel out of control ourselves. You're upset, the conversation is getting tense, and suddenly you find yourself saying things like, "Let's not talk about this right now," or "You're overreacting," or "Why can't you just calm down?" All of these are ways of trying to take back control, not just of the conversation, but of the other person's emotions. But here's a small, powerful truth. Trying to control someone else never brings peace. If anything, it makes the other person dig in deeper. They feel dismissed, pushed away. So instead of controlling them, try something radical. Control yourself. Take a deep breath. Remind yourself of your goal. Not to win, not to dominate, but to stay connected. That might mean saying something like, "This is hard for me too, but I want to understand where you're coming from." Or, if things are getting too heated, try offering a pause. Can we take a break and come back to this when we're both calmer? That's not weakness, that's wisdom. And when you do that, you give the other person a chance to do the same. You're setting a tone. You're creating a space where connection is possible even when agreement isn't. Let me share a quick story that might sound familiar. A woman I know, we'll call her Linda, had a falling out with her daughter over something political. A small comment at dinner turned into a shouting match. Days went by with no phone calls. Linda was heartbroken. Not because she changed her mind, but because the distance between her and her daughter felt unbearable. Eventually, she called her daughter and said, "I'm not calling to argue. I just want you to know that I love you and that your voice matters to me. Even if we see things differently, I still want to understand how you feel." Her daughter cried. They didn't solve their disagreement that day, but they found their way back to each other. That's the power of connection over correctness. Now, sometimes those conversations can't wait, or they're bound to be hard no matter how well you prepare. That's where something called the 3-step rule comes in. And let me tell you, it's a lifesaver. It starts with a simple truth. Most difficult conversations become explosive because we pretend they're not going to be difficult. We walk in thinking, maybe this time it'll go smoothly. And when it doesn't, we get blindsided by the emotion, the heat, the tension. But what if instead we simply said at the beginning, "I know this might be a tough conversation." That one sentence sets the stage. It lowers defenses. It says, "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to talk." It's like preparing someone for a cold swim. You say, "It's going to be chilly when we get in, but we'll get used to it." And once you've acknowledged that, the shock doesn't feel so shocking. After that, the second step is to clearly state your goal. What do you want to get out of this conversation? Do you want more understanding? Do you want to clear up a misunderstanding? Do you just want to share your side of the story without being interrupted? Say so, something like a period. "I want to talk about what happened yesterday because it's been on my mind and I don't want it to come between us." Or even, "I just want to feel closer to you again, and I think talking this through could help." When you state your intention like that, it gives the other person clarity, and often relief. It reminds them that you're not trying to attack or accuse. You're trying to connect. And more often than not, they'll soften a little in response. And then comes the third and perhaps most powerful step: confirm understanding. This doesn't mean agreeing. It means listening, really listening, and then saying, "What I hear you saying is," followed by your own words that reflect what they've just told you. And then you ask, "Did I get that right?" That last part is crucial. It tells them, "I'm not assuming, I'm checking. I care enough to make sure I heard you clearly." And when someone feels truly heard, it's like a wall coming down. Sometimes just hearing your own thoughts reflected back to you helps you feel calmer, clearer, and more open. And that openness, that's where real, lasting connection begins. Let's pause here for a moment. Think about someone in your life you've had a hard time talking to lately. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it's your son or daughter. Maybe it's an old friend who's drifted away. Picture them for a moment. Think about what you might say differently if your goal wasn't to convince them of anything, but simply to let them know you care enough to try. That shift, just that one shift, can change everything. Now imagine you're having one of those hard conversations. You've done the first 2 steps. You've said, "This might be uncomfortable," and you've clearly stated what you hope to achieve. Maybe you've even noticed that the other person seems a little calmer now, or at least they're not shutting down completely. This is where the real work begins. It's easy to say you want to understand someone, but it takes real patience and a little bit of courage to actually do it, especially when you're talking to someone who has views or habits that feel completely different from your own. This is where the third step we mentioned earlier, looping for understanding, becomes more than just a technique. It becomes a gift you offer to the other person and honestly, to yourself. Looping works like this. After the other person shares how they feel or what they believe, you pause. You don't jump in with a rebuttal. You don't say, "Yeah, but..." You just say, "So what I hear you saying is..." And then you do your best to put what they said into your own words. Let's say your brother says something like, "You're always siding with mom, and I'm tired of feeling like the bad guy in this family." That's a loaded statement, and it would be easy to get defensive. But if you're using looping, you might respond with something like a period. "What I hear you saying is you feel left out, like you're being blamed or misunderstood when it comes to mom. Did I get that right?" And then you wait. Give them a moment. Because that's when the magic happens. When someone hears their own emotions reflected back to them in a calm, non-judgmental way, they feel seen. Not attacked, not ignored, seen. And once people feel seen, they're a lot more likely to return the favor. Now you might be wondering, what if I get it wrong? What if I misunderstand what they were trying to say? That's the beautiful part. If you get it wrong and you say, "Did I get that right?" They'll correct you, but gently. They'll say, "Not exactly. What I meant was..." And that gives you even more clarity. It deepens the conversation instead of derailing it. Looping doesn't mean you're agreeing with everything. It just means you're staying engaged. You're staying open, and you're letting the other person know. I care enough to make sure I understand you before I respond. Now let's be honest. This is not always easy. Sometimes the other person says something that pushes all your buttons. Maybe they bring up an old issue. Maybe they take a jab that feels unfair. Maybe they just seem so stuck in their own version of the story that you feel like shouting, "That's not what happened?" But here's the thing. You're not powerless. You still have a choice. You can choose not to let your emotions take the wheel. You can choose to pause, breathe, and ask yourself, what's my goal here? Do I want to punish this person? Or do I want to preserve the connection? That moment, when you choose to respond with calm instead of reacting with anger, is one of the most powerful moments you'll ever have in a relationship. It might not feel like much at the time, but over days, weeks, and years, it adds up. It builds trust, and trust is the foundation of any strong relationship. Let me tell you another story. This one's about a couple named Jerry and Susan. They'd been married for over 40 years, and like most couples, they'd had their fair share of arguments. But there was one subject that always sent them over the edge: money. Every time the topic came up, spending, saving, budgeting, it turned into a battle. Voices were raised. Feelings were hurt. Eventually, they just stopped talking about it altogether, which didn't help either of them. But one day, Jerry decided to try something different. He said to Susan, "I know money has always been a touchy subject for us, and I know I've gotten defensive in the past. But I want to understand why it's such a big stress point for you." At first, Susan bristled. She expected the usual fight. But Jerry didn't push. He just listened. When she talked about growing up with very little, about watching her parents argue over bills, and how scared that made her feel as a child, Jerry repeated back what he heard. "You're saying that when we disagree about money, it brings you back to that fear you had as a kid? That things could fall apart. Is that what you mean?" She nodded. And for the first time in years, they had a conversation about money that didn't end in shouting or silence. All because he stopped trying to fix it or win and instead focused on understanding her world. That's the power of these small shifts. They may seem simple, but they go deep, and they bring people closer in ways that last. Now, sometimes we hold back from these conversations because we're afraid of what will come up. We tell ourselves, it's not worth it, or they'll never change, or I'll just end up more upset than before. And yes, that can happen. But here's what's also true. Nothing changes if we don't try. Avoiding difficult conversations might feel safe in the short term, but over time, it builds walls. It creates distance. And eventually, it leads to loneliness. Not just physical loneliness, but emotional loneliness. The kind where you're surrounded by people you love, but still feel unseen. And that's not what any of us want. We want closeness. We want understanding. We want to feel like we can be ourselves with the people who matter most. And that starts with the courage to stay in the conversation without needing to win it. Another helpful trick is to ask the other person what they need before diving too deep. You can say something like, "Do you want me to just listen right now, or are you looking for feedback?" This little question clears up a lot of confusion. It prevents those frustrating moments where someone just wants to vent, but the other person keeps jumping in with solutions. Sometimes your spouse just wants to be heard, not fixed. Sometimes your friend just needs to talk without being told what to do. And if you're the one speaking, it helps to say that up front too. "I don't need advice. I just need a listening ear." Clear communication about the kind of conversation you're trying to have is just as important as the words you use. And here's something else that might surprise you. The more often you practice these skills, the easier they become. Your brain starts to get used to pausing, reflecting, choosing calm. It's like building a muscle. And over time, those muscles will carry you through even the toughest talks. You may still disagree. You may never see eye to eye on politics, parenting, or where the best place is to spend Christmas. But you'll feel more connected, more respected, more at peace. And at this stage in life, that peace is worth everything. There's something deeply freeing about knowing you can show up to a hard conversation and not lose yourself in it. You don't have to get angry to be heard. You don't have to raise your voice to make a point. And you don't have to avoid the people you love just because you don't see things the same way. The truth is, sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come not from the perfect words, but from the willingness to stay present, especially when things get messy. That willingness tells the other person, "You matter more to me than being right. You matter more to me than winning this argument. I want to understand you, even when I don't agree with you." That's the kind of communication that changes lives. It heals decades-long rifts. It softens resentment. It brings people back to the same table, back into each other's lives, even after distance or silence has crept in. But let's be honest, there are conversations we avoid, not because we don't care, but because we care too much. A child who's made choices you don't understand. A sibling whose political views make your stomach churn. A neighbor who once was a friend, but said something that changed everything. And often, the thought that keeps us quiet is this: if I say how I really feel, we'll never recover from it. But what if saying how you feel, with care, with calm, with clarity, is exactly what makes recovery possible? Let's say you need to talk to your adult daughter about something that's been on your heart. Maybe you've been biting your tongue, but now it's starting to come between you. Maybe it's about how she's raising her children. Maybe it's about something she said last Christmas that you haven't been able to let go. Start with that first step. Acknowledge that the conversation might be uncomfortable. Say something like, "I've been sitting on this for a while because I didn't want to upset you, but I also know that not talking about it has put some space between us." That simple truth lays a gentle foundation. Then, share your goal. I want us to feel closer again. And I think being honest with each other, even if we don't agree, is how we do that. Now you've opened the door. You've said, "This might be hard, but it's worth it." From there, you listen. You ask questions that go deeper than the surface. You reflect what you hear, not to be polite, but to make sure you're truly hearing it. And in the process, something incredible happens. The conversation becomes less about the issue itself and more about the relationship. Because most of the time, it's not just about what was said. It's about how it made someone feel. Disrespected, dismissed, unimportant. And when you give them the space to say that, and you really hear it, that's when healing begins. Now, sometimes you'll try all of this and still hit a wall. Not every conversation ends in a warm hug or instant resolution. Some people aren't ready to talk. Some wounds need time, and that's okay. Because what you're doing isn't about controlling someone else's response. It's about showing up with your best self. It's about making sure that if there's a bridge to be built, you're not the one holding the wrecking ball. And that brings us to something just as important as talking to others. Talking to yourself. We often enter conversations without really knowing why something's bothering us. It shows up as anger, but underneath that anger, there's usually something else: hurt, fear, guilt, sadness. If you take the time to ask yourself, what am I really feeling? What do I actually want from this person or this conversation? You'll walk in with much more clarity. Maybe you're not mad about the way your husband rearranged the garage. Maybe you're feeling invisible, like your voice doesn't matter in your own home. Maybe it's not really about your friend forgetting to call you on your birthday. It's that you're feeling lonely, and it reminded you that your circle has gotten smaller. That level of self-awareness helps you speak from a place of truth, not just frustration. And the people you care about will feel the difference. So yes, talk to the people around you with empathy. But don't forget to talk to yourself the same way. Ask questions. Be honest. Show yourself the same patience and grace you offer others. That's how we stop arguments before they even begin, by knowing what's actually at the heart of the matter. Let's not pretend this is always easy. Some days you'll say the wrong thing. Some days you'll lose your temper. Some days you'll try your best, and the other person still won't meet you halfway. But here's what matters most. You tried. You showed up with love instead of pride. You remembered that connection is more important than being right. And over time, those efforts build a legacy, not just of good conversations, but of strong relationships. And really, isn't that what we want? To finish this chapter of life not surrounded by silence or bitterness, but by people who still call, who still visit, who still see us, and feel seen in return. That's the gift of healthy communication. It's not loud or flashy. It doesn't always come with applause, but it's powerful, it's healing, and it's available to anyone who's willing to learn. So if you're watching this and thinking about someone you've been avoiding, someone you miss, someone who matters, it's not too late. You don't need to fix everything in one talk. You just need to take one step toward understanding. Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's a letter. Maybe it's a quiet moment on the porch where you turn and say, "I know we don't always see eye to eye, but I want us to keep talking." That's how it begins. And if this video helped you in any way or reminded you of someone in your life, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your stories matter here. And if you found this helpful, give the video a like so others can find it too. Don't forget to subscribe to Strong Elderly Life. We're here to help you grow, connect, and thrive at every stage of life, with tips, conversations, and real support for everything that matters most. And remember, you don't need perfect words to have powerful conversations. You just need to show up with an open heart, a little patience, and a willingness to listen. Here's to living your best life, at any age. You've got this.